Now, today we are going to start a series of discussion regarding synaptic plasticity, which is a very important property of the brain. And this property is very important for learning and memory. Now, life is a continuous process of learning. Now, at every moment of our lives, we are constantly acquiring new knowledge and skills, and this happens due to the interaction with the environment. As you see in this slide, a boy is engaged in the process of learning, and according to dictionary, learning is the acquisition of knowledge or skills through experience, through study, or by being taught. Now, when this process of learning occurs, there are changes which goes on in the brain, and these changes enable us to hold on to the knowledge which has been acquired. So, plasticity, by definition, is the quality of being plastic, and especially the quality of being molded or altered. So, in a sense, our brains are being molded and altered based on our learning experience. Therefore, the exercise of learning involves experience and repetition, while plasticity emphasizes the capacity to change in response to that learning. Now, this figure should be familiar to us from the series of neuronal transmission, which we had already discussed. And here we see two neurons which are arranged in tandem, which are in communication with each other. The transmission of information along a neuron takes place along the axon, and this mode of transmission is electrical transmission, whereas the transmission of information between the two neurons across a space which is called the synapse occurs by the process of chemical transmission. The direction of transmission in such a neuronal arrangement is unidirectional in nature. Now, as we had discussed earlier, such combination of neurons are capable of forming complex neuronal circuits, which can account for the various complex neurocircuitry, which are present in the brain and which enables the expression of human behavior. Now, what happens in this case, we are seeing here is there is a crosstalk which is constantly happening across this gap, that is across this synaptic space between the two neurons. Now, what happens in this case is that there is a strengthening of synaptic connection, and when this synaptic strengthening occurs, as you see here, the crosstalk between the two presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron is encouraged, and the synaptic strength between these two neurons increases. Whereas there can also be incidences where there is a weakening of synaptic connection, and therefore the crosstalk or the interaction between these two neurons decreases compared to that of the normal. And this phenomenon of increase or decrease in the synaptic strength is called synaptic plasticity. Therefore, the adaptive changes that can occur at a synapse resulting in weakening or strengthening of synaptic connection is called synaptic plasticity. Now, what purpose does this synaptic plasticity serve us with respect to our adaptation to this world? So this is a kind of adaptation which happens in the brain, and it can happen at the single neuron level, that is at the level of a single neuron, as well as the synaptic level, that is the interaction between two neurons. And we will be more concentrating on this kind of synaptic plasticity, which can be classified into two types: short-term plasticity, which operates over short time scale, and long-term plasticity, which occurs at long time scale. Now, if you look at the advantages which occur due to this plasticity, there are computational advantages. For example, the dynamic nature of the brain networks and the information coding in the brain is influenced by short-term plasticity, whereas long-term plasticity forms the basis of learning and memory. Plasticity also helps us in homeostasis, that is, in order to maintain an equilibrium in the face of changing environment as well as internal changes, and it increases efficiency and robustness of our sensory inputs. Now, synaptic plasticity, therefore, can influence the structure and function of entire neuronal circuits and lead to the reconfiguration of neuronal circuits. It is dynamic in nature and it causes a change in synaptic transmission between neurons. It can occur in response to environmental influences, and the duration of this synaptic strengthening or weakening can last from milliseconds to, in the case of short-term plasticity, to over years in the case of long-term plasticity. And one should not think that the synaptic plasticity changes is restricted only to the synapses. Changes also can occur within the neurons, that is the presynaptic and the postsynaptic neuron, and also within the glial cells, which provide a supporting network for these neurons to operate. Now, this brings us, in order to understand this concept, we have to look more closely at the events which occur at the synapse during the chemical transmission of information from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. So this is an enlarged view which is showing us what happens when the action potential or the nerve impulse reaches the terminus of the first neuron, that is the presynaptic neuron. Now, in the presynaptic neuron, there are neurotransmitters or chemical messengers which are packaged inside vesicles. When an action potential or impulse reaches the terminus of the presynaptic neuron, these vesicles are fused with the presynaptic membrane, leading to the release of the neurotransmitter. These neurotransmitters then sit on the receptors which are present in the postsynaptic membrane, and this leads to the change in certain changes which takes place in the postsynaptic neuron, and this occurs due to change in ion permeability, which is brought about by these receptors which are now occupied by the neurotransmitters. Now, what are the changes which can accompany the increase in connection or strengthening of this synapse, that is interaction of these two neurons across this synapse? This might be brought about by changes in the number of ion channels which are present in the postsynaptic membrane, that is increase in the number of ion channels, the increase in the effectiveness or properties of these ion channels, and also the changes in the number of vesicles or size of vesicles which are packaged with neurotransmitter which are present on this presynaptic site. We will focus our attention to only excitatory synapses, and these excitatory synapses usually secrete the neurotransmitter glutamate to the synaptic space, and these glutamate neurotransmitter then goes and binds to its receptor. There are two kinds of receptors which are important here, which is the AMPA receptor and the NMDA receptor, which play very distinct roles in synaptic plasticity. Now, the strengths or the interaction between the synapses vary in an activity-dependent manner, and as we have mentioned earlier, can operate over short time scales in the case of short-term plasticity or longer time scales in the case of long-term plasticity. Since long-term plasticity can last over a lifetime, it has very important implications, as we shall see, with respect to learning and memory, and this involves two distinct processes, which is long-term potentiation as well as long-term depression. But first, we shall focus upon short-term plasticity, which involves two phases. One is synaptic facilitation and synaptic depression. Now, in short-term plasticity and in the phase of synaptic facilitation, now if two or more action potentials arrive at the presynaptic neuron, that is neuron number 1, which is going to pass on the information to neuron 2, that is postsynaptic neuron. If two or more action potentials or nerve impulses reach the presynaptic terminal within a few milliseconds of each other, what happens at the postsynaptic terminal is the action potential, the amplitude of the action potential is increased. Now, this one has to remember that what we discussed during the neuronal transmission series, that when the strength of the impulse increases, it is not the amplitude of the action potential, but the frequency of the action potential is changed. But this is not like that. This is where the amplitude of the action potential is actually increasing. Now, what happens is after this process is over, that is this facilitation, this is called the synaptic facilitation, and this occurs due to increase in synaptic communication between the two neurons, the neuron 1 and neuron 2, that is the presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron. So if the interval between the two stimuli is increased, however, you no longer observe this potentiation or facilitation. Now, what happens in the phase of synaptic depression is immediately after this increase in amplitude of the, which is observed in the nerve impulse of the postsynaptic neuron, there is a rapid decrease in the amplitude which occurs, and this phase is called the synaptic depression. Therefore, in short-term plasticity, this increase in synaptic strength is only there or present or persists for only a very short period of time. Now, the question is, why does this synaptic facilitation occur, and why do the synaptic depression phase follow the phase of synaptic facilitation? How can we understand it? Now, what happens with respect to chemical transmission is during the facilitation phase. Now, I have to mention here that the fusion of this synaptic vesicle onto this membrane and the release of the neurotransmitter, this fusion process is dependent on a divalent cation, or in short, calcium ion, which is present at the presynaptic terminal. So the calcium in the presynaptic terminal increases during the facilitation phase, and this leads to increased probability of vesicle fusion and release of neurotransmitter in this synaptic space, and hence this leads to rapid firing of the postsynaptic neuron. Thereby, synaptic facilitation occurs. However, if this goes on for some period of time, the pool or the number of synaptic vesicles which is present in this terminal of the presynaptic neuron, that pool is depleted. This decreases the probability of release of the neurotransmitter. Therefore, concurrently, the synaptic current in the postsynaptic neuron is also decreased after such repeated firing. So this is what happens during short-term plasticity. That is, first synaptic facilitation happens, and then it is followed by synaptic depression. So short-term plasticity is only possible for short duration of time. Now let's come to the aspect of long-term plasticity. In the case of long-term plasticity, we become very interested because these changes between in the synaptic strength between two neurons, these changes can be very permanent and can be there and can persist for a very long period of time, for years. And therefore, scientists have been very interested in this phenomenon because this can form the basis of learning and memory. Now, in this case, we have to first see is a theory which was proposed by the famous psychologist Donald Hebb, which is called the Hebb's theory of learning and memory. Now, Donald Hebb, in his book entitled Organization of Behavior, suggested or proposed the neural basis of learning, memory, and other psychological processes. And this involved three changes. One is the formation, the synaptic changes, the formation of cell assemblies, and the formation of phase sequences which connect these neurophysiological changes. Now, what is the synaptic changes which have proposed to be occurring during the process of memory formation and learning? And this can be discussed by the discussion of the Hebb's synapse theory, which postulate which states that when an axon of cell A, suppose this is cell A, is near enough to excite a cell B and repeatedly or persistently takes part in firing it, what happens is there is some growth of processes, that is, these extensions or metabolic changes which happen in this around this synaptic region, by which the efficiency of transmission of information between the neuron A and neuron B increases. So this is when neuron A is very close to B and persistently fires fires synapse B, action potential in synapse B, then there is some metabolic changes which occur in this synaptic space which increases the efficiency or collaboration of transmission of information between these two neurons. That is, the synaptic strength is increased. This is called the Hebb's synapse. Now, in the cell assembly part of the postulate, it suggests that a set of neurons and their connecting pathways which act together will activate a reverberating circuit, neuronal circuit, involving many connected pathways. And this will lead to the formation of cell assemblies that are modified to facilitate future signals transduction. So there is, due to this increase in synaptic connection between a particular set of neurons, these set of neurons actually in turn form assemblies. Now, in the phase sequence part of the postulate, it states that a number of such cell assemblies connected by neural activity over time can be defined as a phase sequence. And this is your train of thought which connects cell assemblies. That is, when certain cell assemblies which are corresponding to a certain unique learning process are arranged in a particular manner in time, that results in a train of thought. So the interactions amongst these three concepts, that is, when you take ideas from these three concepts of Hebb's synapse, cell assembly, and phase sequence, what you come up to is the adage, which is very popular, that is, the neurons which fire together wire together. Therefore, the neuronal pathways which are consistently activated together become physiologically modified in order to facilitate further signal transduction. That is, there is better communication between neurons when they tend to fire together and lie in close proximity. Now, this is a visual representation of such a cell assembly as suggested by Hebb. Suppose this assembly corresponds to when you learn about how an apple looks, and this is a particular kind of cell assembly which represents how a banana appears to you. So, co-activation of a group of cells during this learning process of this is an apple and this is a banana has caused connections to form in these circuits. And this has happened through a process which is called Hebbian learning. Now, when you recall that what should an apple or a banana look like, there is subsequent activation of a subset of these cells which reactivate in this cell assembly. And this is basically how memories are formed and then subsequently recalled. Now, with respect to the neurons, how can you visualize this process? Now, what you are seeing is this is a postsynaptic neuron, and there are several presynaptic neurons which are making simultaneous contact with this postsynaptic neuron. Now, in this case, all these three neurons, they pass correlated inputs which are better able to communicate with this postsynaptic cell. This leads to the strengthening of the synapses because these inputs are very coordinated. You see the neuronal patterns are very coordinated, and therefore they form a correlated pattern, and this increases the strength of the synapse between the three neurons which are present in input 1. Therefore, the activity of the presynaptic terminal and the postsynaptic neuron being highly correlated leads to the strengthening of the synapse and also might lead to the formation of additional synapse between these presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. However, if you observe what is happening here, that these two neurons in input 2 are not sending correlated inputs. Their inputs are very disjointed. That is, and therefore, what happens in this case is there is loss of synapse between these two presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron, and these synapses gradually weaken and are eventually eliminated. You will notice here that the nature of the output from the postsynaptic neuron is closely similar to that of the input which has been sent by these correlated inputs. So the nature of the output ultimately matches that of the correlated inputs which has been passed on by these three presynaptic neurons. So the communication here is strengthened, whereas the communication between the presynaptic neurons which sent uncorrelated impulses, the communication is weakened. Now, this is a representation of Hebbian learning process in the form of a neural network, which is very often cited, and it shows that there is increase in connections between certain neurons present in this neural circuit. Now, this is a video which will show us more about, which will tell us more in pictures about what is happening during when a neuron is placed on a tissue culture plate. What you see is a lone brain cell present in a neural tissue culture. You can see it is extending out axons where it is trying to reach out to other neurons in order to communicate. This is more better illustrated in this time-lapse video where you see multiple neurons and you see with time the huge increase in interactions between the neurons, which is happening during this time period. So in summary, we can say that the exercise of learning involves experience and repetition, and plasticity emphasizes the capacity of change in response to the learning, which enables us to store what we have learned. The adaptive changes that can occur at the synapse that result in the weakening or strengthening of synaptic connections is what is called synaptic plasticity. The strength of the synapses vary in an activity-dependent manner. In short-term plasticity, this synaptic changes can last for seconds or minutes and includes two phases. These two phases are called facilitation and depression. In the case of long-term plasticity, these increase in synaptic strength can last for a lifetime, and these include two phenomena, which is long-term potentiation and long-term depression, which we will see in more detail later. According to Hebb's neurophysiological postulate, there are three concepts: Hebb's synapse, cell assembly, and phase sequence, which gives rise to the uh, often quoted phrase that is the neurons which wired together, which shows that neurons which coordinately fired actually establish stronger synaptic connections. And when the activity of the presynaptic terminal and postsynaptic neuron is highly correlated, the synapses are strengthened, and there is also formation of additional synapses between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron, which gives rise to the potentiation.